today it's all about getting a grip on vocabulary when you're learning a new language.
Absolutely.
We've got a whole stack of research that you sent our way, and one that I'm really excited to dig into is this learning vocabulary in another language.
Oh, yeah. It's really exciting to think about all the different ways people approach vocabulary learning. You know, a lot of people just think it's all about memorizing translations.
Yeah.
But it's way more complicated than that.
Well, I'm ready to have my mind blown. So let's dive in. What does this research say about what it really means to know a word?
Well, this learning vocabulary in another language piece, it highlights this concept of 9 facets of word knowledge.
Okay.
And it argues that truly knowing a word, it goes way beyond just a simple translation.
Okay.
So, you know, think about a word like run in English.
Yeah.
We use it for so many different things, like a person running a business, running a nose running.
Right.
Each context requires a slightly different understanding of the word.
So then, how does that apply to learning a new language? Because it seems like a single translation wouldn't be enough to capture all those shades of meaning.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. It means that learning a word requires encountering it in different situations and understanding how its meaning shifts. So just a single flashcard with the translation isn't going to cut it.
Right. Like, I remember that time I tried to order coffee in Italy, and I ended up with a glass of milk because I knew the word for coffee. Yeah. But I guess I missed some crucial context.
Right.
So let's move on to a classic tool, the dictionary. Is it still relevant in today's world with all the instant translations we have?
I think dictionaries are definitely still valuable.
Okay.
But, you know, this research, the learning vocabulary in another language, it points out that they can actually slow down reading comprehension.
Really?
If learners aren't using them strategically, you really need to be able to decode the information, find the right definition, and then apply it correctly.
Right.
And that can be tricky.
So it's about using it as a tool for deepening understanding, not just a quick fix for every word you don't know.
Precisely. Because mindlessly looking up every word can disrupt the flow of reading, and the research suggests it might not even help you remember the word in the long run.
That's interesting. So it seems like the research is emphasizing active learning over passive lookup.
Yeah.
What about learning from context? Can we really pick up vocabulary just by reading and listening?
Well, that's where the debate about incidental versus intentional learning comes in.
Right.
While this learning vocabulary in another language piece acknowledges that incidental learning does happen, it also points out that it can be a pretty slow and haphazard process.
Okay.
And that intentional strategies, like what they call rich instruction, are likely to be more effective for solid retention.
So what does this rich instruction look like in practice?
Well, think about multiple exposures to the word spaced retrieval practice and applying it in different contexts.
Okay.
Like imagine you're learning the word for happy in your target language. Instead of just seeing it on a flashcard once you encounter it in a song, then you use it to describe a picture, and later you use it in a conversation with a language partner.
Okay.
That way you're solidifying your understanding from different angles.
Makes sense. It's about weaving the word into your learning experience, not just treating it as a random piece of data. And speaking of data, the research mentioned needing to know like 95 to 98% of the words in a text to really understand it. That seems like a daunting task.
It is, and it really highlights why building a solid vocabulary foundation is so important.
Right.
You don't want to constantly be stumbling over unknown words when you're trying to read or listen.
For sure. And speaking of building blocks, this research, learning vocabulary in another language, points out that a huge percentage of English words, something like over 50% after the first 1,000, are formed from roots and affixes.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That seems like a powerful tool we can leverage.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine being able to decode the meaning of a new word just by recognizing its parts. It's like having a secret code breaker for the language.
So instead of memorizing every single word, you're learning a system, a framework for understanding.
Exactly. Of course, it's important to teach word parts strategically, focusing on high-frequency affixes and building on existing knowledge.
Makes sense. You wouldn't teach someone advanced calculus before they'd mastered basic algebra.
Right.
So we've talked about individual words, and we've talked about word parts. Let's shift gears and talk about how those words combine. The research mentions something called collocations.
Yeah, collocations. This is where things get really interesting.
I'm all ears. What are they and why are they so important for fluent language?
So think about the phrase, make a mistake. We don't say do a mistake or create a mistake.
Right.
Collocations are these word pairings that native speakers just use naturally without even thinking about it.
Okay.
They're really the building blocks of fluent, natural-sounding language.
So knowing individual words isn't enough.
Yeah.
We need to understand how they fit together, how they combine to create meaning.
Yes. And research suggests that these memorized chunks, not individual words, actually form the bulk of a speaker's lexicon.
Wow. That's mind-blowing. So fluent speech is less about stringing together individual words and more about using these pre-assembled chunks.
Exactly.
It sounds like learning collocations should be a priority then.
Absolutely. It's like having a toolbox full of pre-assembled parts instead of having to build everything from scratch every time you want to say something.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
This is all starting to make so much more sense. We've gone from individual words to word parts to these chunks of language called collocations. But with so many strategies out there, how does someone even begin to figure out what works best for them?
Well, that's where learning vocabulary in another language emphasizes the importance of individualization.
Okay.
What works for one person might not work for another. It depends on your goals, your learning style, and even the environment where you're learning.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Nope. But that's actually empowering. You get to experiment, try different things, and discover what resonates with you.
Okay.
You become the architect of your own learning journey.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
And speaking of the learning journey, it seems like the environment where you're learning would play a big role.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about it. Are you learning for academic purposes, for travel, for casual conversation?
Yeah.
Each context calls for different vocabulary and different learning strategies.
So if I'm preparing to study abroad in Spain, I should probably focus on academic Spanish vocabulary and maybe practice having conversations about university life.
Exactly.
Whereas if I'm going on vacation, I'd want to learn phrases for ordering food, asking for directions, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And even within those broad categories, there are nuances.
Right.
Are you mainly reading textbooks, listening to podcasts, or engaging in conversations?
Yeah.
Learning vocabulary in another language encourages learners to analyze their specific environment and tailor their strategies accordingly.
So if I'm mainly going to be listening to lectures, I should probably focus on honing my listening comprehension skills and learning vocabulary related to the lecture topics.
Right. It's all about being mindful and making choices that align with your goals and the environment where you're learning.
This is making me think about all the times I've struggled to learn vocabulary from those generic word lists. It's no wonder I couldn't remember any of it. It wasn't connected to my life or my goals.
Right. Context is key.
Yes.
It provides meaning, relevance, and connections that isolated words just can't offer.
For sure. And that brings us back to the power of incidental learning through activities like reading.
Yeah.
We touched on extensive reading earlier for fluency building.
Right.
But what about intensive reading? Can that help with vocabulary acquisition too?
Oh, intensive reading where you're really digging deep into a text can be a fantastic way to build vocabulary.
Okay.
Remember that research we mentioned about needing 95 to 98% coverage of known words for adequate comprehension? Intensive reading can help you get there.
But intensive reading can also be pretty slow going, especially when you're stopping to look up every other word. Is there a way to make it more efficient?
Absolutely. Learning vocabulary in another language suggests focusing on high-frequency words, those that appear across many different texts, rather than getting bogged down by every single unknown word.
So prioritize learning the words that will give me the most bang for my buck.
Exactly. Think of it as identifying the most important tools in your language toolbox.
I like that.
And don't forget about all those strategies we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Using context clues, breaking words down into their parts, and even creating personalized flashcards.
So it sounds like we're talking about active reading, really engaging with the text and the vocabulary.
Exactly. The more you interact with a word, the more likely you are to remember it. And speaking of interaction, one of the most powerful forms of interaction for language learning is negotiation of meaning.
Negotiation of meaning. I've never heard of that. What is that?
So imagine you're having a conversation and you come across a word you don't understand. Instead of just letting it slide, you ask for clarification, you rephrase, you might use gestures. You actively negotiate the meaning with your conversation partner.
Oh, I get it. Like that time when I was in France trying to buy train tickets, and I didn't know the word for round trip, so I ended up miming a train going back and forth.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. And research has shown that this kind of negotiation of meaning actually boosts vocabulary acquisition.
Really?
When you have to work for the meaning, it tends to stick with you better.
That's so interesting. So those moments of confusion can actually be valuable learning opportunities.
Absolutely. Every stumble can be a stepping stone on your language learning journey.
I like that.
And learning vocabulary in another language emphasizes that this principle applies not just to conversation, but also to reading and writing activities.
Okay. This is all so helpful. But I have to admit, sometimes the sheer volume of vocabulary just feels overwhelming. Are there any tricks for managing that sense of information overload?
Well, one technique that's been shown to be effective is breaking down vocabulary learning into manageable chunks.
Okay. Instead of trying to memorize a giant list of random words, focus on a smaller set of words related to a specific theme or topic that interests you.
So instead of trying to learn a random assortment of nouns, verbs, and adjectives, I might learn vocabulary related to cooking, travel, or music, something that speaks to my interests.
Exactly. It's about creating connections and making the learning process more meaningful. And speaking of meaningful learning, let's talk about a technique that taps into our visual and creative sides. Semantic mapping.
Semantic mapping. That rings a bell. Something about diagrams and showing relationships between words.
That's it. Semantic mapping is all about visually representing connections between words.
Okay.
You might start with a central concept like food, and then branch out to include related words like fruits, vegetables, cooking methods, and so on.
So instead of just seeing a list of words, I'm creating a visual network that helps me understand how those words relate to each other. Exactly. And research shows that this kind of visual organization can make vocabulary much easier to remember. It's like creating a mental map of the language that you can easily navigate.
This makes me think about how we organize information in general. It seems like having a system for categorizing and connecting words could be really helpful for long-term retention.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another key aspect of vocabulary learning: developing efficient strategies for storing and retrieving information.
So it's not just about learning the words, but also figuring out how to file them away in my brain so I can access them later.
Precisely. And that's where mnemonic devices, spaced repetition, and even the simple act of writing things down can come in handy.
Wait, are we talking about those silly rhymes and acronyms from school? Do those actually work?
They can be surprisingly effective, especially if you make them personal and meaningful.
Okay.
Instead of using a generic mnemonic, create one that connects the word to a personal memory, a funny image, or even a song lyric.
So if I'm trying to remember the Spanish word for apple, which is manzana, I might create a mental image of a man eating an apple on a mansion porch.
That's a great example. It's all about finding those quirky connections that will trigger your memory.
Okay.
And the more outlandish or humorous the association, the better it tends to stick.
It sounds like vocabulary learning isn't just about memorization. It's about creativity, problem solving, and even a bit of playfulness.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's a constant process of discovery, experimentation, and finding what works best for you.
This has been so insightful. We've covered a lot of ground, from the nuances of word knowledge to the power of learning strategies and the importance of having fun along the way.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners so far?
I think the key takeaway is to view vocabulary acquisition as an active and engaging journey of exploration.
Yeah.
It's about empowering yourself to take control of your learning experiment with different strategies and find joy in the process of expanding your linguistic horizons. But we've only just begun our deep dive into this research.
There's so much more to explore. Next, we'll be delving into specific activities and techniques to put all of these principles into practice. So we've talked about a lot of different approaches to learning vocabulary, from dictionaries to incidental learning to mnemonic devices. It's fascinating to see how much research has gone into this.
It really is. And there's so many practical tools and techniques that we can use to make vocabulary acquisition both more effective and more enjoyable. Learning vocabulary in another language actually devotes a whole section to specific activities and exercises. Should we dive into those?
Absolutely. I love putting ideas into practice. So where should we start?
Well, remember how we were talking about the importance of personalizing your learning?
Yeah.
One really good way to do that is by creating your own vocabulary lists. But we're not talking about those generic lists that you might find in a textbook.
Okay.
These are curated lists that are tailored to your specific needs and interests.
So if I'm really into cooking, I might create a list of vocabulary related to different ingredients or cooking techniques or even kitchen utensils.
Exactly. And you can even take it a step further by organizing your lists in a way that makes sense to you.
Okay.
Maybe you group words by theme, by part of speech, or even by level of difficulty.
I like that. It's about making the vocabulary relevant to my life and my learning goals.
Right. And once you have your personalized lists, you can start incorporating them into all sorts of activities. Remember those flashcards we talked about?
Yeah.
They can be a fantastic tool for practicing and reviewing vocabulary.
But we're not talking about those boring old flashcards with just the word on one side and a translation on the other, right?
Definitely not. The key is to make your flashcards interactive and engaging.
Okay.
Think about adding pictures, example sentences, even recordings of yourself saying the word.
So it's about turning each flashcard into a mini lesson, a multi-sensory experience.
Precisely. And don't be afraid to get creative. You can use different colors, fonts, and even drawings to make your flashcards stand out and really appeal to your learning style.
I'm starting to see how flashcards could be a lot more fun and effective than I originally thought. But what about when you want to practice vocabulary in a more interactive way? Are there any games or activities we can use?
Oh, absolutely. Games are a fantastic way to make vocabulary learning both fun and engaging, and there are so many options out there.
I'm intrigued. Give me some examples.
Well, there are classic word games like Scrabble and Boggle, which are great for practicing spelling and word recognition.
Right.
And then there are games that focus on specific vocabulary areas like food travel or hobbies.
Okay.
And of course, there are all sorts of online games that let you compete with other language learners around the world.
I love the idea of using games to learn. It just takes the pressure off and makes the process feel less like studying and more like just having fun.
Exactly. And the best part is that you're often so engrossed in the game that you don't even realize how much vocabulary you're picking up.
That reminds me of how much I learned from watching movies and TV shows in my target language. It didn't even feel like studying at the time.
That's a great example of incidental learning in action.
Yeah.
It highlights the importance of really immersing yourself in the language as much as possible. But, even with all these fun activities, there are times when we need to buckle down and do some serious vocabulary study.
Right.
Learning vocabulary in another language actually suggests a few techniques for making that kind of intensive study more effective. Have you ever heard of the keyword method?
Keyword method. That sounds vaguely familiar. Is that the one where you create a mental image to link a new word to a familiar word or concept?
That's the one. It's especially helpful for memorizing vocabulary that doesn't have any obvious connections to your native language.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So let's say you're trying to learn the word Fenster in German, which means window.
Okay, Fenster.
You might notice that Fenster sounds a bit like Fenster.
Fenster. Okay.
So you could create a mental image of someone stirring a pot of paint next to a fence right in front of a window.
That's actually pretty clever. The sillier and more vivid the image, the easier it is to remember.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of the keyword method. It taps into your creativity and helps you create these personalized connections that are meaningful to you.
I like it. This is making me realize that vocabulary learning isn't just about rote memorization. It's about finding creative ways to make the information stick.
Absolutely. And another really powerful technique for improving retention is spaced repetition. Have you ever heard of that?
I've heard of it, but I'm not sure I totally understand how it works. Can you explain?
Sure. So it's based on the idea that we naturally forget information over time.
Right.
But we can strengthen our memories by reviewing that information at spaced intervals.
Okay.
So instead of cramming a bunch of vocabulary words right before a test and then forgetting them all, you would review them at increasingly longer intervals.
So maybe I learn a new word today, review it tomorrow, then again in a few days, and then again a week later. That way the information stays fresh in my mind.
Exactly. And there are actually all sorts of apps and software programs that can help you manage spaced repetition. They'll track your progress and remind you when it's time to review certain words.
That sounds really efficient, but also kind of technical. Are there any simpler techniques that don't require using apps or software?
Oh, absolutely. One of the simplest but most effective techniques is just the good old-fashioned method of writing things down.
Okay.
There's something about the physical act of writing that helps solidify information in our memories.
I've always been a big believer in taking notes by hand, even in the digital age.
Yeah.
There's just something about it that helps me remember things better.
And it doesn't have to be fancy. You can simply write down new vocabulary words, their translations, and maybe an example sentence. Or you could even create your own personalized vocabulary notebook organized by theme or topic.
Oh, I love the idea of a dedicated vocabulary notebook. It's like a treasure trove of all the new words I've learned.
And it's a great way to track your progress and see how much you've accomplished. Speaking of progress, it's important to remember that vocabulary acquisition is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
There will be ups and downs, moments of frustration, and moments of triumph. The key is to stay motivated and find ways to make the process enjoyable.
It's encouraging to hear that. Sometimes it feels like I'll never master all the vocabulary I need to be fluent.
Well, that's where this concept of learner autonomy comes in.
Okay.
Remember how learning vocabulary in another language emphasizes that successful language learners are really active participants in their own learning process? They set goals, monitor their progress, experiment with different strategies, and most importantly, they take responsibility for their own learning.
So it's not about passively waiting for the knowledge to magically appear,
Yeah.
but proactively seeking it out and finding what works best for me.
Exactly. And that involves developing self-awareness, understanding your own personal learning style, and being willing to experiment with different approaches. There's no one right way to learn vocabulary. What matters is finding what works for you and sticking with it.
That makes sense. All this talk about strategies and learner autonomy is making me wonder, are there any specific activities or exercises that can help put these principles into practice? Something concrete that learners can actually try out?
Absolutely. Learning vocabulary in another language provides a treasure trove of practical activities, from creating personalized word lists to using flashcards to designing vocabulary games. Let's explore some of those in detail.
Okay, so we've got these personalized word lists, and we talked about making flashcards more interactive and engaging. What other activities does the research recommend?
Well, one that can be really fun and effective is incorporating vocabulary games into your routine. It's just a way to make the process more enjoyable. And let's face it, sometimes vocabulary drills can feel a bit dry.
Games. Now, you're speaking my language. What kind of games are we talking about?
Oh, there's a whole world of possibilities out there. You've got your classic word games like Scrabble and Boggle. You can find tons of online games, even mobile apps that are designed specifically for language learning. And you can even get creative and design your own games.
So it could be anything from a crossword puzzle with definitions as clues to a matching game where you pair words with their synonyms.
Exactly. And you can even turn it into a social activity by playing with language partners or classmates. It's a win-win. You're learning, you're having fun, and you're connecting with others.
I love that. It just takes the pressure off and turns learning into a much more enjoyable experience.
Yeah.
But what about those times when I need to really buckle down and focus on specific vocabulary? Are there any techniques for that kind of intensive study?
One technique that's really stood the test of time is using flashcards. But as we discussed earlier, it's not just about writing a word on one side and its translation on the other. It's about making those flashcards interactive and multisensory.
Interactive and multi-sensory. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Think about adding pictures, creating example sentences, even recording yourself saying the word. You can even use different colors or fonts to highlight key features. The more senses you engage, the better that word is going to stick in your memory.
So it's like creating a mini lesson for each word, personalized and engaging.
That's a great way to put it. And research has shown that learners who use flashcards in this really active and creative way, they tend to retain vocabulary much better than those who just passively review them.
I'm starting to see flashcards in a whole new light. This is making me realize that vocabulary learning isn't just about memorization. It's about creativity. It's about problem solving. And it's even about having a sense of play.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's a constant process of discovery, experimentation, and finding what works best for you.
Well, this deep dive has been incredible.
Yeah.
We've gone from the complexities of word knowledge to the power of learning strategies, and you've given me so many practical tools to try. What's the most important thing you want our listener to take away from this conversation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that vocabulary acquisition is an active and engaging journey. It's about empowering yourself to take control of your learning experiment with different strategies, and most importantly, have fun along the way.
Beautifully said. As you continue on your language learning journey, just remember that you're not alone. There's a whole world of research and resources out there to support you. So embrace the challenge, have fun, and never stop exploring the fascinating world of words.